you for all of the those who are participating and leading discussions and helping behind the scenes. So I'll hand it back.
All right, thank you so much, Laurel. And yeah, so as Laurel mentioned, the goal of this series as a whole is to take a kind of pulse check on how the wildfire crisis strategy is rolling out across the West and how it's being experienced by folks in the landscapes on the ground working on implementation. And that is who we have tried to gather here in these Zoom rooms. In the last session, we dove into some overall reflections on the entire wildfire crisis strategy so far, as well as some very specific topical conversations. We had a pretty wide array of diverse conversations. So to save time for a recap, we'd like to point you towards our notes document, which is available by request over email. And if you were registered for that first session, it should be in your inbox already. And with that, we're gonna move on to today's session. So I'd like to introduce some collaborators from the NOCO Fireshed who have helped us design this session and some of whom we'll be hearing from later in the case study presentation. So first from CFRI, we've got Chaska Waiwaka and Tony Chang. From Pyrologics, we've got Matt Thompson, and from the Forest Service, we've got Daniel Godwin, and those will be the presenters later on. And we've also got from the Ecological Restoration Institute, Amy Waltz and Melanie Colavito, who were a huge help in planning. And again, this session is going to focus exclusively on prioritization, which is really critical and cross-cutting question across pretty much all of wildfire resilience and forest restoration work. Kind of the question of how to work strategically, spend this money where it will make the most impact, and balance multiple interests, land ownerships, and management regimes all at the same time. And from our initial outreach conversations and planning this series, we heard that the priority landscape designation has spurred a lot of pivots and changes in prioritization strategies, whether trying new tools and innovating or trying to figure out where these new priorities align with existing prioritization efforts. We are going to try to give you all as the opportunity to dive into as many of those different angles into the question of how to prioritize wildfire crisis funding as possible. That being said, it is a huge topic, and we want to emphasize that we are focusing on the questions of prioritization as they relate to the shared context of the wildfire crisis strategy priority landscape investments. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emery to talk about logistics.
Yeah, just a few quick notes before we dive into the bulk of this session. Wanted to let people know that we realize that in the time that we have together, we'll probably be opening up some questions and conversations and connections, but want to give folks the opportunity to follow up on those after this session. So as with our first session, we would like to share out names and contact information of folks who attended this session. And if you would like to have your name not on that list, please let Cole or I know by private chat, and we can definitely make sure to take you off before we make that send out. Another important just note reminder is that we will be taking notes in our breakout room discussions for kind of a session wrap-up summary. And so we'll be recording those breakout sessions purely for note-taking purposes. All of those notes are synthesized and anonymized. But again, if that's something that you would prefer, we do not record your breakout session, let us know and we'll try to make some arrangements. So both of those things, if you would like to not have your contact information shared, and if you're kind of hesitant with breakout session recording, let us know in the chat box. Just a few other quick reminders or updates. If you are interested in this topic of prioritization, the NFF and is working with the folks with the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, and they have as part of their ongoing peer learning session, a session on prioritization coming up at the end of March. So I'm gonna paste that information in the chat box. If this is something that you'd like to explore further, it's March 26th and registration info is in the chat box. Lastly, the Forest Service has come out with kind of a but annual update on the wildfire crisis strategy. And so that's available on their landing page for the crisis strategy, and Lee is going to paste that link in the chat box. But one of the announcements that the agency rolled out, I think last week or the week before, was a funding announcement for what it's calling the Collaborative Wildfire Risk Reduction Program. And that's $100 million that's available for actually landscapes outside of these 21 priority landscapes that are still in the WUI and experience high wildfire hazard, but just kind of an opportunity to share with other partners outside of these priority landscapes. With that, quickly go over our agenda. So we're going to dive into breakout room discussions for until about 10:45 Mountain Time. And then after that, we'll transition back into the full group room and hear from the presentation from the NOCO Fire Shed. That presentation, as well as the question and answer session afterwards, are going to be recorded. So if you do have to drop off early, that will be available for folks to take a look at afterwards. I cannot remember if I've already said this, but we are extending the session until 11:45 Mountain Time in order to create some more space for breakout room discussions. Hopefully folks receive that in an email from Cole. But again, if you do have to drop off, everything will be recorded. And we'll be taking questions in the chat box throughout the presentation. So feel free to leave a question and we'll relay that to our speakers, even if you have to jump off early. All right, whew. With that, I think we're gonna dive into some discussions. So for our breakout rooms today, we are gonna have Lee is our kind of lovely back-end support is making breakout rooms, and Lee, just give me a nudge if you don't have those ready yet, but folks should be automatically assigned to breakout rooms, and we'll have a member of kind of our planning team that's kicking off the discussion, as well as some note takers that are going to be also keeping an eye on the time. We will have our questions, our breakout room questions, pasted in the chat box. And I think that's it. Hopefully this can be like a for some connections and starting this conversation before we hear from the NOCO Fire Shed folks. Cole, did I miss anything before we head into breakouts?
I think you got it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, Lee, fire up those breakout rooms whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I just need one more second, please. I'm just making sure I've got the right people in the right room.
Wonderful.
Sure. So our quick contingency was to do a quick chatterfall activity just to get folks thinking about prioritization, again, its sense for how people are experiencing it in your landscape. So in the chat box, if folks could type but not press enter, one or two words that describe how you're experiencing or your sentiment about prioritization in your landscape. Please take a few seconds to do that. Again, type it in the chat box, don't press enter, and then we'll all press enter at the same time so we can kind of see those answers and not be worrying about answers rolling in as we're trying to think about. Oh, I got the, so take a few seconds, type a word, don't press enter, give it like 15 more seconds. All right. Hopefully seeing people looking up from their keyboards. So now I'll press enter and we should see those words come up. Inconsistent. Collaborative, go slow to go fast. Fast, slow, go slow to go fast. Questions, collaborative.
Hopeful, optimistic, inconsistent. It's challenging to scale. Nice.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. So we got the word from Lee that breakout rooms are ready. So hopefully we can dive into those words and experiences and feelings a little bit more.
Thanks so much.
Am I the only facilitator that ended our session on time? Dang,
That was spot on, Tony.
come on, man. You know, I was stalling too. Did you notice that? I was kind of a couple minutes left.
I'm muted. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had some fruitful conversations or starts of conversations. We are going to turn it over to our NOCO Fireshed presentation right now. So I'm going to hand it over to, I believe Tony's kicking us off. But before I do, just wanted to remind people that this presentation will be recorded. And yeah, please submit questions in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that and then putting them forward to our presenters at the end. And with that, Tony, you want to take it away?
Great. Yeah, thank you. So thanks for RVCC for inviting us and convening this and having other folks from like FactNet help put this together. And thanks for everybody that's participating on the webinar here. I know that all of us probably have a lot of busy things to do, and the fact that you're taking time to participate is really valuable. And I've interfaced with RVCC for around 25 years, since kind of the early days, so it's always a pleasure for me to continue this partnership. My name is Tony Cheng. I'm the director for the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, and I'm a professor in the forestry program at Colorado State University. And all of us presenters that are listed here have played an active role in the inception and evolution of the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative. I think I'm going to call it probably different names. A lot of times we just call it NOCO. I'll try to be very precise talking about the collaborative. The collaborative is actually an umbrella organization. It's a multi-party collaborative group in the Northern Colorado Front Range associated with the Colorado Front Range Wildfire Crisis Strategy landscape. But the Fireshed and a lot of the collaboration that has happened that fed into it long predates WCS, like most of the collaboratives attending this webinar. Each of us here is going to present components of the NCS, the NOCO collaborative's approach to strategy and the role of so-called prioritization processes. So we're going to start from high-level concepts about what strategy is, what it isn't, and how those concepts are translated into practice through a collaborative assessment of delineations and quantitative assessment tools. And then how those results are brought into environmental analysis and implementation. Along the way, we'll endeavor to touch on takeaways from responses to the previous webinar. We also hope to expand on the difference between strategy and prioritization, and if and how prioritization is actually a valuable concept and activity in order to achieve your strategic objectives. Next slide. Just want to orient you to the NOCO landscape. For those of you that are familiar, it refers to a geographic area from basically I-70 along the Front Range, the I-25 corridor from Denver up to the Wyoming border, and then up to basically the Continental Divide, or the crest of the Central Rocky Mountains. It really encompasses the Arapahoe-Roosevelt National Forest and its adjacent lands and jurisdictions. The crisis strategy landscape actually extends further south into the Pike San Isabel, but we're going to focus here on the NOCO landscape. And as you can see, it's not just a single landscape, like probably a lot of your landscapes, very diverse jurisdictions and land ownerships that really compels a collaborative approach. So we can't do this without a lot of different kinds of multiple scales and engagement across the different partnerships. So getting to the why, the NOCO Fireshed really it had its inception in early 2016. And it was during it came out of conversations among the collaborative group that was at that time organized around the Front Range Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project, the CFLRP. So CFLRP is really an antecedent to our fireshed and the WCS landscape. Even after about 20 years worth of treatments, one of the things that we were experiencing, and it shows on the map, were very large fires that were overwhelming the scope and scale of the mechanical and manual treatment work. So on the map, what you see here is west of Fort Collins, Colorado. The Cameron Peak fire burned in 2020, burned into the Hyde Park fire that burned in 2012. And then southwest of that is the East Troublesome fire that burned in 2020, jumped the Continental Divide about 6 miles of alpine, landed into the east part of the valley in that Rocky Mountain National Park, and ran into Estes Park, where it was subsequently stomped out. But it was a very frightening moment. For those of you in California, Oregon, and elsewhere, those 200,000 acre footprints probably look eerily familiar to your 2020 fires in terms of their size and wind-driven patterns. You can also see how those fires dwarfed thousands of mechanical vegetation treatments conducted since the early 2000s, all those little pockmarks that you see. The exception is those areas of larger footprints of prescribed fires, those red blobs. And so with the accumulation of both scientific research and observational experiences of land and fire managers really pointed us to the need to restore fire in more places under low and moderate conditions, really expanding that fire footprint. But so that's great, right? That's the problem, that's the challenge. But how do you get there? Where do you do this? What's the best place? What type of fire do we want to achieve? Who's going to do it, and what is their capacity, and how does that occur? And these are really social organizational problems. As much as it is a technical analytical problem, it's issues of capacity, alignment, collaboration, planning, getting on the same page as far as what's happening. And so you need a robust strategy to correspond to those challenges. So kind of going back to the title, we're trying to put strategy back into wildfire crisis strategy. An inspiration for us, because strategy is such an overused and maybe misused term, we've really drawn the inspiration of our work from Richard Rummelt, this book in particular, among others. And while Rummelt primarily focuses on the business world, the concepts are really portable to public lands, natural resource, and wildland fire management contexts. To paraphrase out of Rummelt's work, strategy is a portfolio of connected and reinforcing activities to address the clearly diagnosed challenge. So in this definition, prioritization isn't the same as strategy, right? It's one potential activity, but to be truly strategic, prioritization needs to be connected to and reinforcing of other activities. If you just plop a prioritization map into a collaborative process without connecting it to other collaborative process components, it's very unstrategic. So I maybe feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is really foundational orientation for us. So here's a diagram of what sort of a draft. I'm not going to dig into the details, but a good strategy clearly defines who performs what actions, with who else, where, why, and how. So this is a Kumu diagram. Those of you who've kind of messed around in Kumu, it's a great tool online. The third speaker, Daniel Godwin, crafted this to begin to outline these strategic connections and actions, who is involved at what stage to take what actions. So if you play Where's Waldo, where's prioritization? Prioritization is just one component of that is connected to and reinforcing of many other actions. So we have a ton of partners. and so who participates at what point of the collaborative process and the planning process is a critical component of that strategy. So we also had to recognize that there's a spectrum of readiness among those entities to engage in landscape analysis and strategic planning. We talked a lot about that in my breakout group. So we had to do a lot of stage setting and collaborative development in order to stage when different partners were ready to enter into a more technical spatial analytical process. Not everybody was at that stage. So that was part of this report, which is kind of a publication of our discovery of the different stages of collaborative readiness. And so we really have worked through these 4 steps. Not going to dig into it too much. That's probably another webinar session, but that's a resource on the CFRI's webpage and something that Chaska may end up talking a little bit more about. Yeah, so I'm just going to end my session with my part of the talk here with some photos. If you want to move to the next slide, Chaska. There we go. I want to show just a few images of how the NOCO Fireshed employed geospatial analytics like pods and quantitative risk assessments, not in just one workshop, but over a series of workshops and over several years to update and refine as more learning occurs. So it became part and parcel of interactions and communications. And Matt and Daniel will follow up with some of the more of the details of kind of how those ideas got more and more refined as we got more comfortable using these tools. So it's not just a one-shot deal. It's kind of like, you know, if you really are skilled in using, you know, a router, if you're doing woodworking, it takes you a long time to develop the skill to use that tool. So this slide shows how pods were, oh, can you go to the previous slide? Yeah, shows how pods were deployed by CFRI and the Rocky Mountain Research Station to facilitate NOCO Fireshed participants to assess how fire moves across the geography and then what the management options are depending on what those conditions are. Right, so it's a sort of a fire propagation assessment from the landscape inward to communities approach. So pods really help set the stage for how wildland fire management at the landscape scale can be integrated and incorporated into more fine scale mitigation response and recovery actions. So that's kind of one thing that we try to do is really create kind of a telescoping and accordion approach to engaging different kinds of partners at different scales and how fire interacts with their values and landscape. And that's a comment by Monty Williams there. The QRA, the quantitative risk assessment tools were customized and deployed by both the Forest Service and CFRI to facilitate NOCO Fireshed participants to assess how fires might affect as the fires are moving into areas with highly valued resources and assets, how they interact both positively and negatively. We oftentimes talk about the negatives, but these are fire adapted landscapes. Fire needs to occur in order to have healthy ecosystems. So that combination of the pods and QRA was really important in that accordion and telescoping. And Chaska is also going to talk a little bit more about that. It's also on the very far right, there's an example of how the results were brought into a environmental assessment by the Boulder Ranger District called the St. Vrain Forest Health Project. So awaiting final decision at any time. And so these are now being incorporated at least into the Forest Service's planning. We're also seeing a lot of these tools and results being incorporated into community wildfire protection planning to really achieve kind of a seamless planning environment across the landscape. So to cap my part, the main purpose of the Fireshed is to have a robust social organizational process that can operate at multiple scales. That is a really important part of how we are implementing this strategy. So there's a lot of details and history of the Fireshed that we won't cover here. So at that point, though, I'll turn it over to Matt Thompson.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Yeah, I'm Matt Thompson. I spent 14 years with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and now I'm with Pyrologics, continuing work in risk analysis and decision support, which has really been kind of the the central focus of my career to date. And, analytics are near and dear to my heart. I think they provide huge value add for kind of understanding the context. There's been major advances in how we simulate fire behavior, its transmission across the landscape. There's been a whole host of strategic and prioritization tools out there, like fire sheds, like pods that Tony mentioned, like the quantitative wildfire risk assessment. They have application to landscape scale planning, as shown on the bottom left, which is combining some analytics on where fires tend to stop, paired with delineation of pod boundaries, paired with the quantitative wildfire risk assessment. We're seeing increasing adoption in the wildfire response world. The middle is showing an image from the risk management assistance dashboard. And on the right, we have really powerful spatial optimization tools like the Forces engine that Alan Ager developed that can really help ingest a lot of these risk analytics and come up with optimized treatment schedules that are sequenced. And as Tony shared, we're being in many places, outpaced and outscaled by fire. And so even with the influx of resources from the crisis strategy and the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, there is still a huge need to prioritize these investments and treatment implementation in the areas at highest risk, and to sequence them kind of intentionally. Next slide, please. But to reinforce what Tony said, a prioritization map alone does not define a strategy. And one more kind of recommended bit of strategy reading would be this paper, What is Strategy by Michael Porter. And it reinforces this idea that strategy is a system of activities. And what I'm showing here is sort of a simplified representation of what the ARP and the NOCO fire shed are doing, which is it has these key themes of a stable treatment portfolio, a connected landscape ribbon that Daniel will speak to, very much driven by this cross-boundary collaboration that is focusing on watershed and WUI risk reduction, among other things. But that's all reinforced by this other system of activities like thinning and applying prescribed fire and priority locations, condition-based NEPA, risk-informed suppression response, leveraging pods, and of course the prioritization tools, geospatial analysis, fire behavior modeling. And what I really want to highlight is a good strategy and a good system of activities builds what Michael Porter refers to as fit. And that is, at a minimum, these activities are consistent with each other in terms of moving towards that North Star, having a shared understanding and appreciation of the magnitude of the challenge. Ideally, they can be reinforcing an optimized effort. And that really brings me to this notion of leverage, which came up in our facilitation subgroup of just, we really need to figure out how we can sequence things in a way that expand opportunities into the future. Next slide, please. Another theme that came up in our discussion group was just the importance of getting these groups of people to work together, to communicate together. And so this notion that we need to not only be focusing on pace and scale in the implementation phase, but as well as the planning and collaborative phases. And so this notion that we can create leverage in terms of buying time, perhaps by identifying areas of consensus with tools like Forces very early on, so that can buy time for more collaboration, but also by designing that into the front end. So for example, I've seen risk assessments that were done by, for example, one ranger district, and that ranger district alone, that actually slowed down the process when it was shared with collaborators. Had they not instead been brought there from the beginning, there could have been a broader discussion of values and priorities. And so this notion that good strategy really emerges from social systems, and we could be focusing on the questions of how do we increase pace and scale across our collaborative, our planning, and our implementation systems. Next slide, please. And so just to dig a little bit more into the notion of leverage and having good strategy, create leverage for pace and scale. This, what you're seeing here is a reinterpretation of some data that we published in Fire Ecology in 2023. Typically in the field treatment literature, leverage is looked at for every acre I treat today, how many future acres of burning did I avoid? Obviously, that's important for things like WUI risk reduction. In many cases, the leverage ratios are not that impressive. Some studies, for example, you need to treat 60 acres for every 1 acre of burning avoided. I think we can invert the notion of leverage, which is actually to facilitate the expansion of proactive use of fire and prescribed fire, as Daniel will talk to. So what we're seeing here is that if you design your treatment strategy in such a way that reduces the transmission from federal lands, you can actually expand and promote opportunities for more burning. And I think in areas like dry forest types where we need that reintroduction of fire, designing our strategies with that ultimate objective in mind, I think there's a lot of tools and prioritization systems that can help us get there if we frame our questions in the right way. So next slide, please, Chaska. So again, with this notion of good strategy creating leverage for pace and scale, this is a stylized example that Angela Hollingsworth helped us develop, where in some systems and some landscapes where appropriate, you could begin by hardening pod boundaries. And what that does is not only supports, for example, fire control and response, but it can actually de-risk future application of prescribed fire. So it's not the case that if you need to treat 20% of a given landscape that you can treat 2% per year. The idea here is that maybe you can treat 0.5% and then 1% and then 5% and then 10% by de-risking your landscape and creating that leverage to both increase pace and scale. And then next slide, please. And this is just the last, my last slide about this notion of holding ourselves accountable for pace and scale. You know, simply tracking acres treated, as I'm sure we all know, has its flaws. It's important for showing magnitude, but course summaries, for example, will not distinguish between 100 1-acre treatments and 100-acre treatment. And so what you're seeing here is drawn from the FACTS database. It's looking at treatment unit sizes for broadcast burns over the past decade. And you can see they track pretty consistently. There's no real clear pulse in 2023. We see a lot of burns in the 10 to 30 acre range. Then we see another pulse in around 100 to 300 acres, which maybe tracks prior mechanical thinning. So as we adopt these more sophisticated risk analysis and prioritization tools and use them in hopefully a way that creates that leverage, maybe we can also hold ourselves accountable to seeing a shift to the right of that distribution where our unit sizes are increasing and we're achieving scale in a meaningful way. And so that does it for me. Thanks very much. I think, Daniel, you're up.
I am. Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Tony. I'm Daniel Godwin, for those in the audience who have not had the pleasure or displeasure of meeting yet. Hopefully pleasure. I use he, him pronouns, and I work here in Fort Collins, Colorado on the Arapahoe and Roosevelt National Forest and Pawnee National Grassland, as well as the Medicine Bow Route and its associated National Grassland Thunder Basin. I work closely here almost exclusively on this, on our kind of expansive Northern Colorado priority landscape here. And the work that I do is almost exclusively along with that with the Northern Colorado Fireshed, which, excuse me, we've heard a little bit about here. And we'll kind of go into more details on this with a bit of a case study. So next slide, Chaska. So, you know, kind of thinking about this from first principles, right? You saw that nice big map showing the size of the fires versus the size of the treatments that we have out there. And this scene is from Cameron Peak. And you can imagine a big run day like that. There's not much you can do about something like that. Not very easily, especially in landscapes that look like the one that you see in this picture. So, you know, if we think about some of the foundational kind of biophysical stuff that are constraining what our
Looks like, oh, there, we've got it back. Daniel, we lost you for just about 30 seconds.
Okay, am I back here? Mic check.
Yep, you're good.
Great. Says my internet connection's unstable. How lovely. Not just my internet connection, my friend. Chaska, can you go to the next slide if you can hear me again? All right. So we know here on the Front Range, most of our fires move from west to east, and you can see that in the shapes of some of those fires there. So That's helpful in that we don't have fires squirreling in all different directions when they do their big run days. We have big wind-driven movement of fires. So that starts to lead us in some additional directions here. So next slide. We also know that fuels treatments here are more effective in our middle elevations. We go from alpine to kind of lodgepole, high altitude forest, to our dry mix conifer, kind of ponderosa belt, down into shrubby grasslands and down into the shortgrass prairie, right? And you can burn your shortgrass prairie about every year, and it's not going to do much in terms of fire risk. And our shrubs resprout relatively quickly, but ponderosa belt we can actually do something about. And higher altitudes, it's kind of a mixed bag. We'll get into that. Next slide. And we also know that we've got limited time, right? You know, I joke that every time you say pace and scale, you've got to take a shot. It's something that's become a bit of a shibboleth now, but at the same time, we do honestly have to increase the pace and the scale because we got a lot of work to do before it gets a lot harder to do it. It's getting hotter and drier. Our burn windows are shortening. Our pile burning windows are shortening, and we know another big one's coming, right? So we've got work to do. Next slide. So that leads us to this idea that we've been kicking around here for a while of the ribbon. And you know, friends of the fire shed often hear me talk about how I don't love the title of the ribbon because it's you know, it doesn't necessarily convey a sense of protection or strength. I think of ribbon dancing as opposed to nature-based climate solutions. But the idea here is that if we break up the landscape with pods the way we already have, if we create linked pods together with treatment using prescribed fire, you know, fire that is no longer called fire use, previous wildfires, all kinds of other treatments, we can link kind of deep and wide connected pods together so that when fires start rolling in from the high country in the lodgepole, ripping along, we have a chance to pick them up somewhere within that ponderosa belt, that dry mix conifer. And so that was the idea, right? Like we had a sense of what this could look like, but we struggled to kind of put all the pieces together, not necessarily from a treatment standpoint, but how to galvanize support across that very complicated network of different organizations and different, you know, landowners and land tenure within that. Next slide. So we started thinking about how we might put all this together. And so we've got to figure out a way to collaboratively identify pods here, right? So where do we want to put our effort? Where can we agree that we can put our effort? And at the foundation of that is the idea of collaborative planning, right? It's we talk a big game throughout the fire service about the cohesive strategy, but we don't really cohere very often, or as much as we could. You know, we have a very robust dispatching service, right? We can bring in a lot of resources together for wildfires, but we're not always as good about working together. And that's something that we're really trying hard here on the forest and within the fire shed to do, is to actually collaborate on this. So that's the foundation of what we're trying to accomplish towards the ribbon. Within that, we can identify and strengthen pod boundaries. You know we can't treat everything out there. We can't go out there and cut every tree to get it ready to put fire on the ground. We can't thin everything by hand in time. And I think that shows when we look at the size of some of the treatments out there. So to do that, we've got to be able to ready landscapes to receive fire, and whether that's unplanned or planned. And the basics of that is strengthening these pod boundaries first, right? And so these roadside fuels treatments make pods useful for prescribed fire or suppression actions, or less than big hammer suppression actions, as I tend to refer to, the fire use that knows no name anymore. And this is all to support burning within pods, right? We know the problem that we have out there is that it's not an issue of too much fire, it's too much fire under bad conditions. We have a lack of fire under the right conditions and too much fire under the worst conditions. And so we want to set ourselves up for success to be able to do a lot more fire, including first entry prescribed fire on sites, where we haven't necessarily prepped every acre. And to do that, we've got to, strengthen these pod boundaries. And we've got to do that with the support of our partners, with a clear vision of what this looks like together with our partners here, all to support that. And then I think the next step around that is also focusing on these WUI treatments as well, right? Because we want to do some of those boutique treatments around communities to support the work that we want to do out there on the landscape. So when we have these strengthened pod boundaries and we've taken some of the large big run day risk out of the landscape by burning within pods or using them to expand unplanned ignitions, and we've got some WUI treatments in place around our communities where we may not be able to otherwise do large scale broadcast burning, that opens the door for a lot more managed fire, right? And moving to the point, and I'll come back to this, but treating wildfires not as a crisis but as an opportunity, right? So what is our wildfire opportunity strategy? And that's what this is trying to get at the end of it. So next slide, please. So how do we do that? Well, first, through the fire shed, we asked people to say who's working where. We had a big map of the fire shed and we said, okay, if you're working in this landscape, please write your community name. Please write, your collaborative group name. And we mapped all those out across this landscape. We knew most of this, but it's always better to just ask people, I find, because you never know what you don't know. Gotta love a tautology. And with that, we found that most people are working within these established watershed collaboratives, right? Like that ended up being a pretty good unit of analysis because they bring in a bunch of different partners, sheriff's departments, which manage private land, wildfire in Colorado for weird historical reasons, different, watershed and forestry groups, HOAs, touch base, Office of Emergency Management, fire departments, they tend to all come together around these watershed forestry collaborative groups. And so we went to these groups and said, okay, let's have a meeting and let's bring a bunch of maps together and let's identify what pods we want to focus our work on, right? All of us together, where do we want to focus? Where do we think we have the best effort based on, all kinds of different elements on there on the landscape. There's the technical parts of it, right? Like how good is the pod boundary? Is it an area where we can, where we think it's treatable? But also things like priority treatment areas coming out of CWPPs, or some of the stuff coming out of the quantitative wildfire risk assessment, some of those elements. So if you look at that map there, it quickly becomes very ugly on a map and has lots of data on there. So we're just trying to layer as much into that as possible. And it went pretty well. We've started identifying these priority pods here. Next slide, please. And you can see, this is we're starting to work our way south. This is actually, there's more pods that have been identified with partners that tie it into that purple polygon down there on the south of the map. But you can see the purple and the kind of, I don't know, grape juice, light grape juice on the north, that cross hatching. Those are both new EAs for fuels treatments that we're doing in this area. And so as we've expanded the green identified pods down to the south, we're also identifying with that, we're moving ahead with a new EA based off of that would connect these two previous conditions-based EAs that are there, the St. Vrain and Black Diamond, with a new one, right? Because that is driven by this collaborative pod-based prioritization process to try and advance more, pod-based or pod edge treatment and interior burning. Next slide, please. And so you can see, yeah, there's the connected dots there, and you can see how this is all starting to move together. We have some wilderness within the mix that we're considering what our treatment options are, and they're trying to make the effort there. You can see where we've got some CEs in the mix that we're going to link together adjacent to this. And I think it's a pretty good process. We're trying to move it forward, recognizing that there are different needs of different groups in the mix and different priorities and different values, and trying to center that in the process from the very beginning, right? So how do we build a landscape scale process that covers a north-south run that's, I don't know, a quarter of the state of Colorado from a north to south standpoint, but building it from the community group up, right? So that it's not a top-down, literally, it's a bottom-up process here. So next slide. So just to put this in the context here of the wildfire crisis strategy landscape here for the Northern Colorado, we're still working our way south. We are now working in Boulder County with partners here and going down towards that kind of west of Denver. And so for the ARP, you go back there, just thank you. That covers the priority area, or the majority of the area within the Northern Colorado Fireshed. Next slide, please. But it's not all roses and ponderosas out there. And so, how do you solve a problem like a lodgepole? And that is sung to how do you solve a problem like Maria? It's tricky, and we don't actually have an answer for that. And one of the ways that we're going about that is shifting our approach in those areas to the other components of the cohesive strategy there, which is, fire adapted communities and safe and effective wildfire response. What if we focus our efforts in work around the communities there, as well as on evacuation routes? And so it's not necessarily the linked deep treatments in that area, the way we're trying to do that in the Ponderosa Belt, but it's still an effective approach. It's still coming up from the bottom up. And then where we can find opportunities for landscape scale treatment to create resilient landscapes, we're going for those as well. The other thing is that, we're blessed to have a lot of really smart people in the communities that we're working with, and in the university systems and the State Forest Service and all these different groups. And so we've stood up through the Fireshed a treatment effectiveness working group, and we're trying to figure out, based on local monitoring and emerging science and everything like that, what should we do about lodgepole? What should we do about these higher altitude sites? Is it, we have some areas that used to be ponderosa that are now lodgepole. Can we outplant those as we move into a hotter, drier future? How can we establish aspen stands? What doesn't work? And we've thankfully, in some ways, had a lot of experiments out there with our big fires on what kind of treatments are not effective in lodgepole. So trying to just bring a bunch of smart people together and try and use that feedback loop to feed back into what we're proposing, and recognizing that that's a moving window. But if we can build consensus, we can at least try and make new mistakes together, as opposed to making the same mistakes together. Next slide, please. Yeah. So, some key takeaways from all this, just this planning process. We have lots of takeaways. It's very packed full of takeaways. context matters and people matter within this process. Different groups or different stages of readiness, to use our parlance here. You know, early in my career, I came to fire from more of an anthropology and geography standpoint. And that was my undergraduate work. And I think of this from a human dimension stand of it more than anything. And the phrase that I really like is that fire is about people on the land, right? And fire, trees, they're going to do their thing. It's kind of independent of our value system. The decisions that we make are driven by people and their values. And you know, the earth doesn't care if it's a shrub field that's been converted from something else. We do. And that's where we try and bring this value into this and be honest about that it's a value-based system. Different groups are at different readiness levels to do this work, to grapple with this. Some have foresters, some have on staff, you know, graduate educated GIS wonks that can roll with this on their scrappy young nonprofits. And some are just like one person that's volunteering their time and struggling. And meeting people where they are is good advice for anything, right? But for this, I think is really important, and trying to not make this a one size fits all approach. And differing values matter and should. This is not just a quantitative exercise. This is not an optimization strategy out there. We can throw all kinds of numbers at the wall. We actually have 3 different quantitative wildfire risk assessments that cover this landscape, 4 if you count one of the nationals. And that still doesn't tell you what to do or why to do it or where to do it. That's all about values. That's about all kinds of other things. And being honest about that up front, I think is really important, right? Let's not pretend that the numbers will tell us what to do. Next slide, please. And again, we have a lot of open questions out there. We are not necessarily doing, we don't have all the answers, and we're trying to at least ask the right questions and come up with new ones. We are directed through the wildfire crisis strategy to expand fuels treatments on non-federal land. And right now it's a little hand wavy the way we're doing that. And how to expand a lot of this work onto private land is challenging. We could do some NEPA planning that covers private lands. Some other forests do that. It's less common here in the West, it seems like. And we're supporting local partners to develop prescribed fire programs as best we can, but that's a bit of a long struggle. And that's something that I think I'd love to hear if anybody else if their forests are doing a good job with that. And then also, how can we best support the emergence and sustenance of prescribed burn associations, right? Neighbors helping neighbors, doing work on the ground. Because if we're honest about the cohesive strategy, it can't just be federal agencies doing this work. It can't just be state agencies doing this work. It's got to be, a million flowers blooming out there, right? How do you get to 1 million acres? You burn 1 million acres, 1 acre at a time, right? Backyard burning is a strategy that can be successful out there to de-risk the landscape. But this is tricky. We've Colorado experienced a pretty damaging and debilitating setback with the lower North Fork escape prescribed fire a number of years ago, which caused a fatality. And that's really changed our kind of social acceptance within agencies, I think, for prescribed fire. But this is a thing we struggle with still. Next slide. Then climate envelope. We know it's going to get worse, right? We know that we're going to lose a lot of prescribed fire windows. And so how do we index our efforts to a moving window? How do we accelerate? How do we make sure we're doing this right and fast? So, that treatment effectiveness working group is also focused on climate treatment effectiveness, trying to center that as a component of this. But there's also, you know, how do we burn all the piles we want to burn when each year we have fewer burn windows? Things like that is tricky. I don't have an answer for that. And if you do, please tell me. Next slide. But then, you know, one of the ways we're trying to get about this is through the use of conditions-based NEPA, but that's also a little bit of a tricky new approach on some of this, right? So if we center partner collaboration, that informs conditions-based NEPA, which we're using to expand pod boundary treatments, which modifies the shape and distribution of pods, which are the basis for analysis for conditions-based NEPA, which will also hopefully be changing what the landscape looks like from a wildfire and fuels and prescribed fire standpoint. So, you know, we are this kind of like Prussian forestry model of thinking about desired stand conditions doesn't work when you have a complex adaptive system like this. We can't tell you what it's going to look like because every time we go through this cycle, things are moving around. And so we're in this kind of non-linear, non-predictable approach, which I think is really exciting as a bit of a nerd on this kind of stuff, right? Like we're modifying pods, the pods are modifying the landscape. That's informing how things are changing within the conditions-based NEPA. And so where we start now with the randomness and the variance in the system that we're creating, we can't necessarily predict what things will look like, right? We don't know what those desired futures will be. We can kind of have an idea of it, but all of this is a moving target in a purposeful and positive way. Next slide, please. And at the end of the day, we're just trying to change the outcome for wildfires too, right? How do we make better decisions? If we're not changing decisions on wildfires, this is kind of, we're not doing this right? Like it's, how do we start to treat wildfires as opportunities when we can? Are we seeing an increase in using unplanned beneficial fire? That's a question that I think we need to be focusing on here and developing key performance indicators around that. At Matt Thompson, I know you've been working on this. How can we measure whether or not we are making decisions that are not just the same old big hammer, throw everything at every ignition, even when we could be burning it out from the road and getting some easy, high quality treatment acres during that day, right? Next slide. And then I want to end my segment here on a bit of a hopeful shift we're seeing out there. And if we're thinking about it from a cohesive strategy perspective, this is all of our work. So I like to call it pods are for everyone, right? We are all pod people now. And so where we're seeing that is, next slide, with the way that our partners are really running with this. Excuse me. You know, some of our partners have started to develop a pods-based treatment planning dashboard. So this is a draft. Thank you, CFRI, for the work that you put into this. State Forest Service here has also been involved, as well as some of the watershed groups. And it's trying to break down pods into treatable acres and what actions can be taken, informed by the cohesive strategy, and being able to do tracking within this. So, you know, we draw the pods and we start trying to democratize the access to all of these analytics out there so that it's people can start looking at, okay, these are the priority pods that we want to work in. Where can we best do treatments as a watershed group to achieve the outcomes on private land that we all want to say? So it's, you know, there's so much data out there. How can we pull the best of it together and make this approachable and then track whether or not we are working towards our goals effectively? And so I think that's really exciting. I think it's really cool to see all of our partners kind of running with this in some different directions. And that's exactly the kind of thing we want to see if we want to be successful here. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Chaska here and let her finish us out here. Thank you.
Yeah, Emery, we're a little over, so if you, I will do my best to speed through my slides, but you can just jump in and tell me to cut to the chase as soon as I'm not sure how many questions we have in the chat, but I'll go quick.
You're good, Chaska. I just wanted to point people toward Cole's message in the chat box about our next session if you want to register for that. And we can take questions in the chat box and also relay them to you all to answer in our kind of summarized takeaways document too. So feel free to run with it. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Okay. So for the home stretch, I want to return to this notion that Tony spoke about telescoping across scales and what that looks like in our portion of the wildfire crisis strategy landscape. So in our landscape, we have a lot of forest-related collaborative networks going back to the Hayman fire in 2002. It's been many subsequent catalysts that has sparked more collaboration upon collaboration. So an important question for us is how to leverage that collaborative infrastructure and align pre-existing decision-making processes and prioritizations. So I'm going to go through a few of the mechanisms that we're using to telescope back and forth to create leverage. And it's going to kind of recap some of the stuff that you've heard. Let's see. So Tony already gave you an overview of the NOCO Fireshed, which is kind of the landscape level collaborative network in place, but there's also at least 9 major collaborative networks and shorter term collaborative processes just in that part of the WCS landscape alone. Not to mention, we've also got work going on outside of the WCS landscape in Grand County. So telescoping primarily looks like cross-participation with district level engagement and local collaborative networks and partners working at larger scales that are then plugging in at different points to support different phases of local collaboration. So that allows us to cross-pollinate ideas, success stories, innovations with other groups in the Fireshed. And that's really important for building that kind of shared vision and building trust. And we come through, we show up. We also recruit the conveners of those local collaborative networks, as well as other community connected partners like conservation districts and so forth that have a little extra capacity to come to more meetings, to join our various standing committees: strategic planning, community engagement and outreach, coordinated operations, adaptive management. And that ensures that the outputs and activities of those committees are informed by people with access to local input and stakeholder perspectives at a smaller scale. For planning, Daniel already covered the PODS prioritization process, which is a big chunk, but otherwise it looks like, sharing tools and processes. So rather than creating one map to rule them all, which would have alienated a lot of our partners, we are bringing those partners into the process of developing this landscape spatial strategy document that lays out principles and components that can be incorporated into smaller scale plans and strategic documents, future NEPA, as well as communications materials and talking points that can be shared across our communication and community engagement specialists. So as Tony, I think, mentioned, we're already seeing pods being incorporated into community wildfire protection plans, for example, to support treatment considerations to create or improve evacuation routes. And we're also seeing, what's exciting to me is like risk data from the collaborative risk assessment that we did, as well as treatment feasibility analytics used in local planning meetings to discuss where risk overlaps with project opportunities and community readiness to do work. For implementation, as somebody already mentioned, our spatial strategy underscores the need for cross-jurisdictional implementation plans that specify who is doing what actions, what kind of funding capacity is needed, and when it will be completed. And that kind of operations coordination, detailed planning tends to happen at the local level. But if we want to sequence actions across the landscape and leverage the limited workforce capacity that we have on the Front Range, then we need that information to feed back up the chain to inform our common operating picture. So a lot of this happens informally, just with the coordinator and the operations group, other folks that are showing up to these meetings and being aware of what partners are doing. But we're also currently working with our State Forest Service to build a customized ARC online platform with pods and other data layers that will help us share information about planned and completed treatments across the Fireshed. And then for kind of telescoping how we monitor and track outcomes across scales, that's still in development. Daniel already described the PODS dashboard, which is super promising, scalable approach not only for planning, but tracking outcomes that moves beyond acres treated. And that could be complemented by a customized modeling tool that we have developed by a colleague of mine to measure changes to wildfire risk and hazard resulting from implemented projects. And that would happen at 3 levels. So the pods level, the sub-landscape level, and the fireshed level, with obviously taking longer to show changes at the fireshed level, but faster for the pod level. And that multi-level approach to assessing outcomes could help us sequence treatments and inform where we target resources. Another alignment question that we're working with is really about money. How to integrate WCS priorities and funding with pre-existing priorities and work processes. So when we learned that our landscape was going to be a part of the wildfire crisis strategy, we immediately decided that we needed a more formal structure and a more streamlined approach to distributing resources to partners. So that the Arapahoe Roosevelt initiated that process by partnering with the National Forest Foundation through a master participating agreement to establish the Northern Colorado Fireshed Fund. And that supports activities of our NOCO Fireshed partners. And through that agreement, NFF became the fiduciary for the fund, and that was seeded with bipartisan infrastructure law money, but it's not limited to that funding. And the steering committee then stood up a new investment committee to make recommendations to the NFF for fund investments based on proposals received from Fireshed partners. And this image is just sort of the diagram pulled from the 2023 charter. But another important piece is that the fund can support partner capacity or on the ground projects. And that capacity piece for funding, that capacity piece of funding for building the readiness of our community connected partners to do community engagement and outreach. It's super important. It allows them to, do the building up their forestry programs or prescribed fire programs, basically otherwise just getting ready to do projects on the ground. The funding for funding criteria for capacity is informed by the readiness framework that Tony mentioned earlier. And we want to just see that folks are, our community connected partners are at least at a stage 2 before we give them funding to deploy projects on the ground. Meanwhile, the principles and components of the landscape spatial strategy that I mentioned, that's going to help inform the project implementation funding criteria. So that later this year, when that rolls out, we'll be directing funds towards projects that are establishing anchor points for future projects or connecting existing projects, tying into past fire footprints, maintaining past fuel treatments, and so forth. Okay, so to wrap up, this webinar has been about collaborative prioritization, but we've emphasized that prioritization is just one step in a larger strategic process. So a combination of pods, quantitative wildfire risk assessment, and other tools is helping us identify where conditions are right to expand beneficial fire and proactive fires safely and effectively. But a big piece of our strategy is also about building the capacity of partners across the landscape to engage communities and build community readiness, because you can't get work done without that. Biophysical and social conditions both need to be right to promote landscape conditions that can receive and recover from fire. So to create the ribbon that Daniel talked about and connect larger projects on Forest Service lands, we're building this portfolio of smaller coordinated actions that are tiered to a larger strategy. We're cultivating this broad network of partners to help us identify windows of opportunity to get work done across boundaries as social conditions allow. And then lastly, I think we're rooting ourselves in the cohesive strategy, and that provides more room for inclusive collaboration and consensus building across scales. It's relevant to place-based community connected partners, helps them establish coherent narratives to show how their actions are going to achieve specific objectives and tier to activities aimed at promoting landscape level resilience. And it helps them see themselves as part of this larger landscape spatial strategy, even if their landscape is not yet ready for expanding beneficial and proactive fire. So if we were to just focus on WCS prioritization, we would be leaving those groups behind. So many more insights. Apologies for going over. I'm going to end it there, and I appreciate your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you to all of our other presenters. And thank you to everyone who has come. We don't have any questions directly in the chat right now, but please feel free to send those to me by email and we can get the presenters to answer them in our notes document. And other than that, I think we are good to go. Really appreciate everyone's engagement with these issues. And a reminder again that our next session is at the same time on March 19th. And we'll be sending out recordings and notes from the breakouts. Anything else, Emery?
Nothing for me. Thanks all.
All right. Thanks, folks. See ya.
Thanks, everybody.